The deal was so absurd that most men would have laughed it off. 10 cents. That was all it cost Ethan McGraw to claim a weather-beaten cabin nestled high in the Colorado Rockies. 10 cents for 4 walls of rough-cut timber, a stone hearth blackened with age, and a roof sagging beneath the weight of snow that lingered even as spring crept into the valley. But Ethan wasn't laughing. He was a mountain man through and through, a soul worn by years of roaming wild country, and to him that cabin was more than lumber and nails. It was a chance at roots, a place to belong. Yet standing before it, his eyes narrowed not at the cabin itself, but at the crude wooden cross staked in the hard earth beside it. The marker carried a single warning: don't dig. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to this channel for more stories of grit, survival, and the untamed heart of the Old West. These are tales you don't want to miss. Ethan shifted the strap of his pack across his broad shoulders, the leather creaking like an old saddle. He had crossed rivers swollen with thaw, climbed ridges sharp enough to tear a horse's hooves, and pushed through miles of wind-bitten country to stand here. A fur trapper by trade, he was no stranger to danger or hardship. His hands bore the proof, calloused, scarred, steady even when holding a rifle through a blizzard. Yet for all the storms he had weathered, nothing unsettled him quite like the grave a few steps from where he planned to lay his head. The Rockies towered around him, their peaks capped with white that glowed under the pale sun. Pines whispered in the wind, and the distant call of a hawk echoed down the valley. It was wild country, untouched, a place where only the strongest or the most stubborn could survive. Ethan was both. But even in this rugged silence, the grave seemed louder than the mountain breeze. Who had been buried here? Why the warning not to dig? And what kind of man sold a cabin with such a shadow for 10 cents? He crouched near the cross, brushing snow from the dirt. The soil looked undisturbed, yet something about it gnawed at his gut. He straightened quickly, reminding himself he had no business with the dead. His concern was the living, and for the first time in years, he aimed to live under a roof of his own. Still, as he turned toward the cabin door, the words on that marker clung to him like burrs on wool. Inside, the air was thick with dust, carrying the scent of pine sap and mold. A broken chair leaned in the corner, its legs chewed by mice. The hearth was cracked but serviceable. Ethan set down his rifle and exhaled a long, steady breath. "Home," he muttered, though the word felt strange on his tongue. For a man who had slept under stars more nights than under shingles, this cabin was no less than a treasure. He ran his hand over the rough logs, imagining the sweat it must have taken to raise them. Whoever had built it had been tough, maybe tougher than him. But what had driven them to leave it behind and bury someone at its side? Ethan's mind returned, as it always did when silence pressed too heavy, to the memory of his younger brother Samuel. An avalanche in the Bitterroots had stolen Samuel years ago, leaving Ethan with nothing but guilt. He had led his brother into that pass, chasing pelts and silver coin, and the mountain had claimed him. Since then, Ethan wandered, a man with no tether. The cabin represented more than shelter. It was penance, perhaps a chance to stand still long enough to stop running from ghosts. Yet here, another ghost waited, its grave a reminder that land carried stories long before he arrived. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the valley like dark fingers. Ethan pulled his coat tighter and lit a small fire in the hearth. Sparks leapt upward, filling the room with fragile light. Outside, the wind shifted, whistling against the cabin walls. It sounded, for the briefest moment, like the scrape of a shovel biting earth. Ethan froze, every muscle taut. Then he shook his head and forced a bitter chuckle. A man hears things in the mountains, he told himself. But his eyes, despite his words, slid back toward the door. Toward the grave. The night promised no peace. Ethan McGraw had never been a man who needed much. A rifle, a sharp knife, a kettle, and the endless wilderness had been enough to carry him through more winters than he cared to count. Yet behind that hardened simplicity lived a weight heavier than any pack. It clung to him each time he crossed a snow-choked pass or gazed at the horizon from a high ridge. The Rockies had given him life, but they had also stolen something he could never recover. He remembered the avalanche in the Bitterroots as clearly as the scar on his left forearm. Snow had thundered down like a wall of white thunder, swallowing his younger brother Samuel before Ethan could even shout his name. Years later, he could still feel the crushing silence that followed, as if the whole mountain had paused to listen to his grief. Since that day, Ethan had wandered the high country alone, never allowing himself the luxury of staying in one place for long. Some said he was born to roam. Truth was, he feared what happened when he stood still, but now as he walked the land surrounding the cabin he had bought for 10 cents, something inside him shifted. He wanted more than pelts and passing seasons. He wanted permanence, a place to set down roots even if those roots grew from rocky soil. Still, with each step past the grave near his cabin, the dream felt brittle. The land stretched wild and unforgiving. Towering pines leaned against the mountain winds, their needles hissing like whispers. The ground was patchy with late snow, and the river that cut through the valley roared with meltwater. To a mountain man like Ethan, these sounds were both familiar and comforting. But the silence that lingered when the wind fell carried another kind of weight. His instincts, sharpened by years of survival, told him this place held more than just timber and stone. It held a story someone had tried to bury. He dropped his pack on a flat rock and sat with his back against a pine, pulling out a strip of dried venison. His dog, a scrawny mutt that had begun trailing him weeks earlier, padded over and sat at his side. The animal's ribs still showed beneath its coat, but its eyes were alert, following every flicker of movement. Ethan tore off a piece of meat and handed it down. "Reckon you got nowhere else to go, same as me," he murmured. The dog chewed eagerly, tail thumping against the dirt. Ethan thought of the years he'd spent trading furs in dusty towns, always an outsider, never welcome long. He had seen men lose themselves to whiskey, cards, and greed, but he had kept to his code: work hard, trust little, and carry only what you could shoulder. Yet for all his discipline, he was still human, still haunted. He had no wife waiting for him, no children calling his name, no fire that wasn't his to tend. Just echoes of Samuel's laughter, carried on the mountain wind, mocking him for surviving alone. The cabin represented change, maybe redemption, but the grave was a barrier he couldn't ignore. At times he felt as though the marker itself was watching him, the words carved into it, not just a warning but a dare. Don't dig. Every time he read it, his chest tightened. Who had written it? Why such desperation? He had learned that in the wilderness, men didn't waste words. If those two had been chosen, they carried weight. The mutt lifted its head suddenly, ears pricking. A crow cawed overhead, circling the grave before vanishing into the treetops. Ethan followed its flight with narrowed eyes. He clenched his jaw, pushing the unease back down. A man don't need to answer every question the mountains ask, he told himself. Yet even as he said it, he knew curiosity had already planted its seed. As dusk painted the valley in shades of blue, Ethan rose and shouldered his pack once more. The fire in the cabin was waiting, and so was the shadow of that grave. The cabin stood firm against the wind, its logs grey with age, yet unyielding. Ethan McGraw circled it slowly, boots crunching on the frosted ground, his eyes tracing every seam between the timbers. Whoever had built it had known the trade of frontier carpentry, chinks stuffed tight with moss, corners notched with precision, the hearth set against the prevailing wind. It wasn't luxury, but it was survival carved into wood and stone. Still, the place carried a hush that went beyond emptiness. The shadow of the grave lingered, reaching across the clearing until it seemed to touch every wall. He set to work as soon as the morning light burned off the mist. His hands were steady, though his mind stirred like unsettled water. The roof sagged under years of snow, and gaps had opened between the logs. With an axe and a few iron nails he had carried, Ethan patched what he could, sweating despite the cold air. His dog padded around the perimeter, sniffing at every corner before settling near the grave, ears pricked as though keeping watch. By midday, Ethan stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. The cabin looked stronger already, though the work had only begun. Yet as he studied his progress, his gaze wandered once again to the mound of earth marked with its warning. Something about the soil gnawed at him. Though weathered by seasons, patches looked darker, as if turned recently. He knelt, running his calloused fingers across the dirt. It felt firm, but his instincts whispered otherwise. He withdrew his hand quickly, brushing the soil from his palm as if it carried heat. That night the fire in the hearth glowed low, throwing shadows across the cabin walls. Ethan chewed on dried venison, his dog curled near his boots. The silence pressed in heavy, broken only by the occasional pop of resin in the flames. Then, faint but certain, came a sound outside, the creak of shifting earth. His head snapped toward the door, muscles taut. The dog lifted its muzzle, growled once, then fell silent, ears pinned. Ethan gripped his rifle, heart pounding, but no further noise followed. Minutes stretched long. Finally, he eased the weapon back against the wall, muttering, "A man hears what he expects to hear." Still, his sleep was restless, dreams filled with images of shovels biting soil. 2 days later, he rode into town for supplies. The place was little more than a cluster of buildings hugging the dirt road, saloon, blacksmith, general store, and a scattering of cabins beyond. Dust clung to the air even in winter, stirred by wagon wheels and boots. Ethan tied his horse near the hitching post, his dog trailing close, and stepped into the store. Conversation halted for a moment as heads turned. Strangers always drew stares, but the pause lingered longer than usual. He asked for flour, salt, and lamp oil. The storekeeper, a wiry man with spectacles perched low, hesitated before measuring out the goods. "You're the one bought Boone's cabin," he said finally, his voice cautious. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "That's right, 10 cents, fair and square." The man pursed his lips. "Cheap price for land up that way. Some say too cheap." He lowered his voice. "There's reasons folks stayed clear of it." Ethan said nothing, only gathered his supplies, but whispers followed him as he left. Outside, 2 old ranch hands stood near the trough, their words drifting on the wind. "He'll learn soon enough," one muttered. The other spat in the dirt. "A man don't sleep easy with Boone's grave at his door." The dog bristled at Ethan's side as they headed back toward the mountains. He tightened his grip on the reins, jaw set. The cabin was his now, grave or no grave. Yet the townsfolk's unease clung to him heavier than the pack on his shoulders. The shadow of that place stretched farther than he had thought, and he was standing squarely inside it. The whispers of town clung to Ethan as he returned to the cabin, each word echoing louder than the crunch of snow under his boots. Boone's grave. Folks had said the name like it carried weight, like the earth itself remembered. By the time he reached his clearing, the sight of the crooked wooden marker stirred more unease than before. The grave wasn't just a warning now, it was a story half told, and everyone in town seemed to know more than he did. The next morning, he rode back down the valley, determined to wrest the truth from their lips. He started at the sheriff's office, a squat building with a star nailed above the door. Sheriff Callahan, a man with a weathered face and eyes sharp as flint, leaned back in his chair when Ethan entered. "You're the one up at Boone's place," Callahan said without preamble. Ethan nodded. "That's me, I paid fair, what's the truth of it? Why's everyone acting like I bought a curse for a dime?" The sheriff's jaw tightened. He tapped the brim of his hat against his knee before answering. "Silas Boone built that cabin 20 years ago. Tough man, tougher than most, but tough don't make you good. He had enemies and plenty of 'em. Folks say he struck something in them hills, gold maybe, or something worth more. One day he was just gone. Next folks knew, a grave popped up by the cabin with that warning carved into it. Nobody ever saw Boone again." Ethan frowned. "And no one thought to dig, see what's truly there?" Callahan's eyes hardened. "Some things ain't worth stirring, McGraw. That land's yours, but I'd tread light. The mountains keep their own justice." Ethan left with more questions than answers, the sheriff's words settling like cold iron in his gut. He crossed the street to Martha Ellis's inn, a sturdy building that smelled of fresh bread and wood smoke. Martha herself stood behind the counter, a woman in her 40s with a kind face but eyes that missed nothing. "You're staying at Boone's place?" she asked as soon as she recognized him. "I am," Ethan replied. "Seems everyone's got an opinion about it but me." "You knew him?" Martha folded her hands, voice softening. "I knew of him. Silas Boone wasn't a man you wanted for a neighbor. He kept to himself, but there were fights. Talk of claims, double dealings. Men vanished around him. Then one winter he disappeared too. Some say he dug too deep, others that someone settled a score. All I know is that Graves showed up, and nobody's dared disturb it since. Ethan studied her face. And you? Do you believe he's in that ground? Martha hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window as if to be sure no one was listening. I believe the earth don't lie, Mr. McGraw. If the mountains warn you, best heed them. Later, outside the saloon, a prospector named Jed Carter caught Ethan by the arm. Jed's beard was matted, his eyes bright with feverish energy. You're sitting on more than wood and stone, stranger, he hissed. Boone found gold. That Graves just a scarecrow to keep men like me away. Don't you dig, and you'll waste the richest land in the Rockies. Ethan jerked his arm free. You sound mighty sure for a man who never had the courage to put a shovel in the ground. Jed sneered. You'll see. The mountain don't give up secrets easy, but it don't keep 'em forever either. As Ethan mounted his horse to ride back, the valley air felt thicker, the sky darker though the sun still shone. The people of town had given him more than warnings. They had given him pieces of a puzzle he hadn't asked to solve, and yet as the trail climbed higher toward his cabin, the words clung to him like smoke. Boone, gold, secrets buried beneath a marker that told him not to dig. The grave waited in silence, its story tightening around Ethan like a noose he hadn't yet felt. The days grew longer, but the silence of the mountains deepened. Ethan McGraw rose each morning with the sun, his breath clouding in the cold air as he split wood, hauled water, and mended the cracks that winter had carved into the cabin walls. His hands stayed busy, yet his mind circled back again and again to the grave a few yards away. No matter how hard he worked, the marker stood in his vision, a reminder that solitude carried its own costs. His dog never strayed far from it, pacing the perimeter of the mound with a restless energy. Sometimes at night, the mutt would wake growling, ears flattened, teeth bared toward the grave, as though warning off an unseen intruder. Ethan would rise from his bedroll, rifle in hand, scanning the clearing while his heart hammered against his ribs. But nothing ever moved. Only the wind stirred, sighing through the pines like a voice too faint to catch. One evening, as the firelight flickered against the cabin's rough-hewn walls, Ethan muttered aloud, "Ain't no sense fightin' shadows, boy." The dog lifted its head, ears twitching as if it too doubted his words. Ethan rubbed his beard, unsettled by the truth in his own tone. He had spent years alone in the wilderness, sleeping under stars and braving storms that would have broken softer men. Yet he had never felt watched the way he did here. Supplies ran thin quicker than he expected. The mountains gave meat but not flour, pelts but not lamp oil. Each trip to town meant enduring the sideways glances of men who spoke of Boone in hushed tones, or the warnings of Martha Ellis, whose voice carried more concern than gossip. "Some solitude heals, Mr. McGraw," she told him as she handed over a sack of grain. "But too much will hollow a man." "That place? It hollows." He thanked her, but her words rode back with him into the hills, rattling around like loose nails in a tin. Each night, as the wind howled, he dreamed of shovels scraping earth, of soil falling heavy on wood. Sometimes he saw Samuel in those dreams, his brother's face pale and distant beneath the snow, lips moving without sound. Ethan would wake gasping, sweat cooling fast in the mountain air. One morning, determined to push back against the unease, he decided to build a fence around the cabin. The work would mark the land as his own, drive a stake into the soil that no shadow could claim. He cut logs, stripped branches, and drove posts into the frozen ground until his arms ached. Yet when he came to the spot where the fence should cross Boone's grave, his hand faltered. The idea of hammering a post beside the marker felt wrong, like trespass. He adjusted the line, leaving the grave outside the fence's embrace. It stood alone, as though even Ethan's claim could not touch it. That night, as he leaned against the doorframe, listening to the dog snore softly inside, Ethan admitted aloud what he had avoided saying. "This land don't want me here. It's telling me plain." His voice sounded small against the sweep of the valley. But then he clenched his jaw, fire hardening in his chest. I've lost too much to run again. This place is mine, and I'll see it through. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of snow on its breath. Ethan stepped back into the cabin, barred the door, and sat by the fire until his eyes grew heavy. Outside, the grave waited, dark against the pale starlight, as if daring him to keep that promise. The grave pulled at Ethan's mind like a lodestone, no matter how he tried to ignore it. Each morning he busied himself with chores, hauling water from the creek, setting snares, chopping wood until his shoulders burned, but the marker remained in his line of sight. Even when he turned his back, he felt its presence pressing against him, a silent reminder that some questions refused to stay buried. The dog sensed it too. At dusk, when the wind rattled through the trees, the mutt planted itself between the cabin and the grave, hackles raised, low growls vibrating in its chest. Ethan tried to shoo it inside. "Ain't nothing out there but dirt and bones," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. The dog didn't move until the moon rose, silver light washing over the clearing. Only then would it curl by the hearth, though its eyes stayed open, fixed on the door. Ethan wrestled with himself in those long nights. He knew the rules of the wilderness. A man who let curiosity override caution often didn't live long enough to regret it. Yet solitude worked on the mind in ways even wolves couldn't match. He caught himself staring out the window, watching the mound until the dark blurred its edges. Sometimes he swore he saw a shadow kneeling beside it, moving as though with a shovel. When he blinked, the space lay empty again. On his next trip to town, he mentioned the grave in passing to Martha Ellis as she wrapped a block of salt pork. "Dog won't leave it be," he said, trying to sound casual. Her hands stilled. "Dogs know more than men sometimes. If yours is uneasy, you ought to listen." He frowned. "You expect me to let a patch of dirt run me off my own land?" Martha's gaze was steady, her voice quiet but firm. "I expect you to mind warnings when they're carved deep enough to outlast the man who made 'em." The words followed him up the trail, heavy as a pack filled with stone. By the time he reached the cabin, clouds had gathered, thick and grey, shrouding the peaks. He stacked firewood under the eaves, the rhythm of his axe striking steady, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Every chop seemed to echo like the thud of a spade. That night, snow fell, a fine powder swirling against the window panes. Ethan sat at the table, knife in hand, whittling a piece of pine to keep his fingers busy. The dog lay nearby, ears twitching at every gust of wind. Ethan muttered half to himself, "A man ought to let the dead be. Digging up the past don't bring peace." He paused, the knife hovering mid-cut. "But sometimes it brings the truth." The words startled him. He hadn't meant to speak them aloud. He dropped the carving, stared into the flames licking the hearthstones. His brother's face rose in memory again, Samuel grinning, alive in the way only memory could keep him. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. If Samuel's grave lay marked with a warning, would he obey it? Or would he dig, desperate to understand the why of it all? The dog lifted its head suddenly, growling deep, eyes fixed on the door. Ethan snatched his rifle and held his breath. Outside, the snow hissed, tapping against the wood. No footsteps followed, no knock, no voice. Just silence and the dog's low rumble. He lowered the weapon slowly, jaw tight. Curiosity had planted its roots, and Ethan knew resisting it would not be easy. The grave would not fade into the background like any other patch of earth. It demanded attention, and though he fought it, some part of him had already decided. The truth buried there would not stay hidden forever. The snow thinned with the coming of spring, and the valleys filled with the roar of meltwater. Ethan McGraw welcomed the change, though it meant harder travel to town. Supplies dwindled fast, and he rode down more often, the dog trotting faithfully at his side. Each trip he felt the stairs sharpen, as though the townsfolk expected to see him broken by the grave or driven out altogether. One morning, as he tied his horse outside the saloon, Jed Carter stepped from the swinging doors, boots crunching in the mud. His face was gaunt, eyes burning with the fever of a man who dreamed of riches just out of reach. He sized Ethan up, lips twisting into a half-smile that carried no warmth. "You're still roosting at Boone's shack," Jed said, voice loud enough for men on the boardwalk to hear. Ethan didn't flinch. I am. Seems it's mine to roost in. Jed spat to the side. Don't reckon it ought to be. That land ain't worth 10 cents unless you count what's buried under it. Boone found gold, McGraw. Everyone knows it. You're just squatting on claims you don't understand. The air between them tightened. Men paused in their business, pretending not to watch but listening close. Ethan's hand hovered near his belt, not on his weapon but close enough to remind Jed he wasn't one to be pushed. I bought the cabin fare, Ethan said, his voice steady, low. No law says otherwise. If you think it's yours, bring proof, not talk. Jed's eyes flashed. Proof 6 feet under, marked plain as day. You dig, you'll find it. And when you do, it won't be just your hands reaching for it. Ethan's jaw set. I told you before, Carter. A man afraid to dig himself shouldn't hound others to do it for him. Sheriff Callahan's voice cut through the tension, hard as a whip crack. That's enough. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his badge glinting in the morning light. This town don't need blood spilled over old dirt. Jed sneered, but stepped back, though his eyes never left Ethan. You can play house up there, mountain man. But the hills don't keep secrets forever. When that ground gives, we'll see who it belongs to. With that, he turned and vanished into the saloon, leaving the crowd to scatter in murmurs. Callahan approached Ethan, his tone quieter but no softer. He's trouble, and trouble has a way of spreading. Best you mind him, McGraw. Boone's grave is drawing eyes, and eyes turn to greed quicker than you'd think. Ethan nodded once, gathering his supplies without another word. He felt the weight of every stare as he rode back toward the mountains, the dog close behind. The ride home stretched longer than usual, the trail muddy, the sky heavy with clouds. Ethan's thoughts churned as steadily as the river beside him. He had lived years avoiding men like Jed, men whose hunger for gold rotted them from the inside out. But now Jed had fixed that hunger on Ethan's land. The grave no longer belonged to silence alone. It had become a spark, and sparks lit fires that consumed everything in their path. By the time Ethan reached the cabin, the sun had sunk low, bleeding red across the ridges. He stood for a long while staring at the marker in the clearing, the words etched into its wood sharp, even in the fading light. Don't dig. The warning was no longer only about what lay beneath. It was about the storm building above ground, too. Spring storms rolled over the mountains, their thunder shaking the cabin walls as rain hissed against the roof. Ethan McGraw sat inside, sharpening his knife by lantern light. When a draft brushed cold against his neck, he frowned, rising to check the log seams. His hand found a loose plank near the hearth, one that shifted under the pressure of his palm. The dog stirred, ears pricked, as Ethan pried it back with the blade's tip. Behind the timber lay a hollow stuffed with yellowed cloth. He pulled the bundle free, brushing away years of dust. Inside were folded letters, brittle but still legible, the ink faded but steady. Ethan laid them on the table, the lantern's glow spilling across words that had not been read in decades. His chest tightened as he traced the name scrawled on the first page, Silas Boone. The handwriting was rough, written by a man more familiar with an axe than a pen. The letters spoke of hardship, of winters that bit harder than wolves, of neighbors who circled his land like vultures. Yet they also spoke of something else, a discovery in the hills, veins of gold or perhaps silver. Boone never said plainly. What he did write again and again was a warning. Men will come for what I found. I cannot trust anyone. Ethan read until his eyes burned. One letter, the last, chilled him most. It was shorter than the others, hurried. They know. I hear them at night. If this reaches anyone, don't let them dig. He leaned back, rubbing his beard, the weight of the words pressing heavy. The grave outside was no ordinary resting place. Boone had hidden something or someone beneath that soil, something worth warning generations against disturbing. The dog whined, tail low, as if it too felt the burden of the discovery. Ethan folded the letters carefully, returning them to the bundle. His mind churned. Boone's story wasn't just gossip spun by townsfolk. It was written in the man's own hand. And it spoke of enemies, men who might still have kin roaming these valleys, men like Jed Carter, whose hunger burned bright enough to ignite violence. The next day, Ethan rode into town with the letters tucked inside his coat. He stopped at the general store for nails and flour, but his true destination was Martha Ellis's inn. She greeted him with her steady eyes, offering a seat and a cup of coffee that steamed against the chill. "You look as though the mountain's pressing on you heavier than usual," she remarked. Ethan set the bundle on the table between them. "Found these hid in my walls." Boone's hand, by the look of it, "Thought you'd know more than me what they mean." Martha's brows knit as she unfolded the brittle pages. She read in silence, lips tightening as her eyes moved over the words. When she finished, she set them down gently, as though afraid they might crumble. "Silas Boone was no saint, but these are a man's last thoughts. I remember his wife coming through town once, desperate, asking after him. Folks turned her away, too frightened to speak. These letters tell why. He feared someone close. He knew death was at his door." Ethan's voice was low. "And that grave? You think he's in it?" Martha shook her head. "I don't know. But I think whoever put that marker there wanted silence, not remembrance." Her words followed him as he left, the letters heavy in his coat. The sky above the mountains was darkening again, another storm gathering. Ethan felt the truth closing in, like thunder rolling across ridges. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a vault of secrets, and he was the only man stubborn enough to guard them. The storm came without warning, rolling over the peaks like an army of black giants. By dusk the sky was bruised purple, and by nightfall snow fell in sheets so thick Ethan McGraw could barely see the line of trees beyond the cabin. The wind howled, rattling shutters and seeping through every crack in the logs. Inside the fire roared, but even its heat seemed fragile against the fury outside. Ethan stacked more wood onto the flames, jaw tight. "This one's settling in for days," he muttered. The dog lay near the hearth, ears twitching with every groan of the cabin walls. The storm pressed against them like a living thing, clawing at the timbers, testing the strength of a man's resolve. By the second day, supplies began to weigh heavy on his mind. The flour was low, the salt pork nearly gone. He rationed carefully, chewing each bite slow, but the gnaw of hunger sat sharp in his belly. Worse than the hunger, though, were the sounds. At first he thought it was the wind carving tricks through the eaves, but as night deepened, the noises sharpened, scraping, steady, like metal cutting earth. His dog leapt to its feet, growling, eyes locked on the door. Ethan froze, heart thudding. The storm screamed outside, yet beneath its roar came that rhythm again. Dig, pause, dig. He gripped his rifle, every nerve pulled taut. "Ain't no man fool enough to be out in this," he whispered. Yet doubt gnawed him raw. He pressed his ear to the wood, breath shallow. The sound faded, swallowed by the wind. When he stepped back, sweat chilled his spine, though the fire burned hot. Sleep gave him no peace. Dreams dragged him into the storm's belly, where shadows dug at Boone's grave with frantic hands. He saw Samuel there too, his brother's face pale beneath snow, mouth moving as though speaking, but the blizzard stole the words. Ethan jolted awake, chest heaving, the dog whining beside him. On the third day, the storm's fury peaked. Snow slammed the roof so heavy he feared it might collapse. He worked feverishly, bracing beams with whatever he had, sweat freezing against his skin. The labor kept him alive, but his thoughts circled the same trap. The letters, the grave, the warning. Don't dig. Boone had written of enemies. Had they buried him there, or something worse? That night, with the wind shrieking through the chinks, he nearly gave in. He stood at the door, shovel in hand, staring into the white blur beyond. His chest rose and fell with the weight of choice. The dog barked once, sharp and urgent, breaking the spell. Ethan cursed, slamming the shovel back against the wall. Not tonight, not like this. His voice cracked under the strain, the words sounding more like a plea than defiance. The storm finally eased on the fourth day, leaving the valley buried under a silence almost heavier than the blizzard itself. Ethan stepped outside into a world remade, the snow waist-deep sparkling under a sky scrubbed clean. But his eyes went first to the grave. Its mound was smooth, blanketed white, as though untouched. Yet a tremor ran through him. He could swear the snow there was thinner, disturbed. The dog barked again, circling the grave, nose to the ground. Ethan's hand closed into a fist, heart hammering. He forced himself to turn away, trudging toward the creek to break ice for water. But the truth had sunk in during the storm's long nights. No matter how hard he resisted, the grave would not let him go. When the thaw came, the mountains seemed to breathe again. Water spilled from the ridges in silver streams, carrying with it the memory of the storm. Ethan McGraw welcomed the clear skies, but peace did not follow. His eyes kept straying to the grave where the snow melted faster than elsewhere, leaving damp earth exposed. The sight gnawed at him, a reminder that the storm had only deepened the mystery rather than burying it. He saddled his horse and rode into town, the dog trotting behind. The air was sharp, and the valley smelled of wet pine. As he tied his reins at the post outside the store, he noticed the way conversations hushed once more. Men leaned closer, voices low, glancing his way, as if the grave had followed him down from the hills. Inside, Sheriff Callahan stood near the counter, speaking with the storekeeper. His expression tightened when he saw Ethan. "We need a word." Ethan followed him outside, where the sheriff's voice dropped to a growl. "Tracks were found near your place after the storm. Fresh ones, not yours." Ethan's brows knit. "Who?" Callahan's gaze was flinty. "Jed Carter's been prowling. Men say he's been talking day and night about Boone's gold. I reckon he means to claim it one way or another." Ethan's jaw clenched. "He sets foot on my land again, he'll find a man waiting, not just a dog." The sheriff held his gaze. "I don't doubt it. But blood spilled in these hills don't wash easy. Boone's grave has stirred greed before, and it's stirring it again. You be careful, McGraw. Some men would rather bury the truth than see it found." Ethan returned to the cabin with those words echoing in his mind. That evening, as dusk bled into the valley, he found the proof for himself. Prints marked the damp earth near the grave, boots, heavy, fresh. He knelt, fingertips brushing the impressions. They cut too deep to be his own, and the spacing spoke of a man in a hurry. His dog growled low, hackles bristling as it sniffed the disturbed soil. Ethan rose slowly, scanning the tree line. The forest stood still, but the sense of being watched pressed hard against him. He tightened his grip on his rifle and muttered, "Carter." The name left his mouth like a curse. That night, sleep came shallow. Each creak of the logs set him upright, rifle ready. He thought of the letters, of Boone's desperate plea, "Don't dig." But someone was trying, shovel or no shovel, to uncover what lay beneath. The danger was no longer only in the earth. It stalked in human form, greedy and restless. At dawn, Ethan rode back into town, slamming the letters onto Callahan's desk. The sheriff read them in silence, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. When he finished, he looked up, voice grim. "This ain't just a grave, it's evidence. If Carter's digging around up there, he ain't just trespassing. He's tampering with a man's death." Ethan leaned forward. "Then stop him." Callahan shook his head. "Evidence is thin, and Carter's slippery. But if he pushes further, I'll have cause. Till then you hold your ground and be ready." Ethan left the office, his chest tight. The valley outside looked ordinary. Children playing near the well, a wagon creaking past, but under it all ran a current of tension, coiled like a rattler waiting to strike. Boone's grave had become more than a warning. It was a claim men were willing to bleed for. When Ethan rode back toward the mountains, he felt it plain. The fight was no longer between him and the silence of the grave. It was between him and living men, and men with greed in their eyes could be deadlier than any storm. Ethan McGraw rode into town with a heaviness that clung tighter than the mountain chill. The letters from Boone weighed on him, not just paper, but testimony carved from fear, desperation, and the certainty of betrayal. He had shared them once with Martha Ellis, yet he felt compelled to place them before her again. Not for answers this time, but for something harder to admit. Trust. The inn smelled of bread and coffee, warmth spilling from its hearth, as though untouched by the shadows of the valley. Martha looked up when Ethan entered, her hands flour-dusted, her expression softening at the sight of him. "You've been carrying more than firewood these days," she said gently. Ethan set the bundle of letters on the counter, his voice low. "I reckon these carry more weight than I can shoulder alone. Thought maybe you'd help me read 'em straight." She wiped her hands, unfolding the pages with care. As her eyes traced Boone's scrawled lines again, her lips pressed into a tight line. Silas Boone was a man feared and hated, but he wasn't a fool. These words, he wrote them knowing death was close. He speaks of enemies, yes, but he also speaks of greed eating at his neighbors. She paused, looking up. I remember his wife, Eliza. She came through here years ago asking after him. No one helped her. We all turned her away. Ethan's brow furrowed. Why? Fear, Martha admitted, her eyes shadowed. Folk feared crossing Boone when he was alive, and they feared his ghost after he was gone. That fear runs deep in this town, Mr. McGraw, deeper than law, deeper than truth. Ethan leaned on the counter, voice rough. Jed Carter's been sniffing around my land. Sheriff says he'll move against him if he can, but Carter won't quit. These letters tie Boone to something buried, and Carter aims to dig till he finds it. If that happens, fear won't be enough to stop him. Martha's gaze softened. And what about you? Will you stop him? Or are you chasing truth same as him, only with cleaner hands? The words struck sharp, though her tone carried no malice. Ethan straightened, silence stretching. At last he said, I ain't after gold. I've seen what that hunger does. I want peace, a place to set down roots. But I can't plant 'em over a lie, not with men like Carter circling. Truth's the only fence that'll hold him out. Martha studied him, then nodded slowly. Then you'll need allies. No man shoulders truth alone and comes out whole. Not here, not anywhere. Her words lingered with him as he rode back through the valley, the dog trotting at his stirrup. The mountains loomed dark against the evening, their silence both familiar and oppressive. He thought of Samuel again, of the avalanche that had stolen his brother, of the crushing weight of solitude that followed. For years he had believed solitude kept him safe. But perhaps Martha was right. Perhaps solitude was only another kind of grave. At the cabin he laid the letters on the table, lantern light flickering over Boone's words. His hand rested on them for a long while, as if by pressing down he could steady the weight they carried. The dog curled at his feet, a reminder he wasn't entirely alone. Ethan whispered into the silence, Trust don't come easy out here, but maybe it's time. His voice sounded rough, unpracticed in confession, yet the words felt true. For the first time since buying the cabin, he didn't feel the burden was his alone. Outside, the grave lay under the pale wash of moonlight, quiet but not forgotten. Its shadow stretched across the clearing, binding him not just to Boone's fate, but to the choices yet to come. The thaw turned the mountain paths to rivers of mud, each hoofstep sinking deep as Ethan McGraw rode home from town. Clouds stacked heavy in the west, dark and low, and the air carried the scent of rain. His thoughts circled the same track, Martha's words about trust, Boone's letters, Jed Carter's hunger. The pieces pressed together like stones in a wall, leaving no room for peace. When he reached the clearing, the first thing he saw was wrong. His fence, the line he had built to mark the land as his own, lay broken in two places. Fresh tracks scarred the damp earth, boot prints pressed deep. His chest tightened as he followed them with his eyes. They led straight to the grave. The dog barked furiously, hackles raised, tail stiff. Ethan slid from his saddle, rifle in hand, his heartbeat thudding like a drum. He crossed the clearing slow, every muscle coiled. The grave was intact, but the soil around it bore fresh marks, the ground disturbed as though men had circled it, probing, testing. He didn't have to wait long to learn whose boots had made the prints. Voices rose from the tree line, rough and careless. Jed Carter stepped out first, two men at his back. His eyes gleamed with a feverish light, his mouth curled into a smile sharp as broken glass. You've been sitting on this prize long enough, McGraw, he called. Boone's gold don't belong to a drifter with no name and no kin. It belongs to men willing to claim it. Ethan raised his rifle, steady though his gut twisted. This land's mine by trade, and no law says different. You cross my fence again, you're trespassing. You come for that grave, you're digging more than dirt. You're digging your own trouble. Jed laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think a cabin bought for 10 cents makes you king of these hills? Boone's bones or Boone's treasure, it don't matter. Whatever lies under there, it's worth more than you, and I'll have it. The men behind him shifted, hands near their belts. The dogs snarled, teeth bared. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger, his voice cutting low, sharp as the wind. "One more step, Carter." "Just one." For a heartbeat, the clearing held still, nothing but breath and thunder rumbling far off. Then Sheriff Callahan's voice rang out, firm as iron. "Enough!" The sheriff rode in from the ridge, rifle across his saddle. His presence split the standoff like a blade through rope. Jed cursed under his breath, but he stepped back, his eyes never leaving Ethan. "This ain't finished," he spat. "You can hide behind a badge for now, but the mountain don't keep secrets. I'll be back." Callahan dismounted, placing himself between the men. "You'll be back in irons if you set foot on this land again without right. Now, clear out before I make that promise true." Jed hesitated, then jerked his chin to his men. They melted into the trees, their laughter trailing like a taunt. The sheriff turned to Ethan, voice low but edged with warning. "You can't hold this alone, McGraw. Carter's greedy, but he ain't stupid. He'll wait, he'll circle, he'll strike when he thinks the law's blind. You best be ready for him, because fear won't scare men like that." Ethan nodded, though his chest felt heavy. "I've faced storms and wolves, Sheriff. Carter's just another kind." "He'll stand." The sheriff studied him, then mounted again. "Stand careful, then. Mountains take men quicker than bullets when pride blinds them." As Callahan rode off, thunder split the sky, rolling over the ridges. Ethan stood by the grave, his rifle in hand, the warning carved into the wood staring back at him. "Don't dig." Yet Carter's words lingered too, sharp and poisonous. Secrets in the soil had already drawn bloodlines in the dust. The grave had haunted Ethan McGraw from the first day he set foot on the land, but after Jed Carter's intrusion, it no longer whispered. It demanded. He could not guard what he didn't understand, nor face down greed with only warnings carved into weathered wood. The choice pressed on him heavier than the mountains themselves. He had resisted for weeks, but the moment had come. At dawn he gathered his shovel and lantern. The dog followed, tail low, as though sensing the weight of his decision. Ethan knelt by the grave, fingers tracing the carved words one last time. "Don't dig." His breath clouded in the chill air. "If I'm to stand against Carter, I need truth, not shadows," he murmured. He set the shovel into the soil. The first thrust was harder than any he'd made, the earth clinging stubbornly as though it too resisted. Each scoop echoed in his ears like a drumbeat, stirring memories of Samuel, of shoveling snow in vain when the avalanche buried his brother. Sweat beaded his brow despite the cold. The dog circled anxiously, whining, ears flat. Hours passed, the hole deepening, the soil dark and damp. Ethan's muscles burned, but he pressed on, every strike fueled by the need to know. Finally, the shovel struck something solid. The dull thud jolted him. He cleared the earth with his hands, lantern light flickering across wood. A box, or no, a coffin, rough-hewn. The lid rotted in places. He hesitated, chest tight. With trembling fingers, he pried the lid open. Inside lay bones, curled and brittle, the remnants of a man long gone. Beside them rested a rusted rifle and scraps of fabric that had once been a coat. No glint of gold, no hidden riches, only the quiet testimony of death. But as Ethan leaned closer, he saw more. The skull bore a fracture, a clean break that spoke not of accident but of violence. This man, Silas Boone most likely, had not died by nature's hand. He had been struck down. Ethan's breath caught. Boone's last letter had spoken of enemies, of men closing in. Now the truth lay clear. Someone had silenced him and buried the evidence with a warning meant to scare off questions. He sat back on his heels, lantern trembling in his grip. "Murder," he whispered. The word tasted like iron. The grave wasn't a warning against greed. It was a plea to leave a crime undisturbed. The dog barked suddenly, jerking Ethan from his thoughts. He turned, lantern swinging, but saw only the tree line. Still, the unease prickled sharp. Jed Carter's words returned to him. "Whatever lies under there, it's worth more than you." Carter didn't want truth, he wanted treasure. And if he knew Ethan had dug, blood would surely follow. Ethan lowered the coffin lid gently, covering the bones with a kind of reverence. Then he filled the grave again, pressing the soil firm until the mound looked untouched. His hands ached, his back screamed, but he worked until the marker stood once more, the warning as sharp as before. Only now Ethan carried the secret within him, the knowledge that Boone's story was written not in riches but in blood. When the last spade of dirt was tamped down, he leaned on the shovel, staring at the words. "You were right, Boone," he muttered. "Some things should stay buried, but not the truth of it, not anymore." The wind sighed through the pines, carrying his vow into the valley. Ethan knew then that he could no longer stand as just a mountain man guarding a cabin. He had become the keeper of justice for a man long dead, and Carter's greed would soon force that justice into the open. Ethan McGraw rode into town, with the weight of Boone's secret pressing hard against his chest. His hands were still raw from digging, his mind haunted by the sight of the fractured skull. He had uncovered truth, but truth without witness was just another ghost. If Carter pressed his claim, the land would drown in blood unless someone set the record straight. Sheriff Callahan was in his office, boots on the desk, when Ethan pushed through the door. The dog followed, nails clicking on the wooden floor. Ethan dropped Boone's final letters on the desk, his voice hard. "I dug." Callahan's eyes narrowed. "You didn't." "I did, and I found him. Bones, rifle, a coffin left to rot, but he wasn't taken by the mountain. His skull's cracked clean through. Murder, Sheriff." The room held still for a long beat, the only sound the wind tapping against the shutters. Finally, Callahan sat forward, his voice low. "That grave's been a shadow over this town for 20 years. You've stirred it, McGraw, and shadows don't vanish easy." "They don't vanish at all," Ethan said, his jaw tight, "unless light's thrown on 'em." Before more could be said, shouting broke in from the street. Ethan and the sheriff stepped outside to find Jed Carter standing on the boardwalk. A small crowd gathered. His voice carried, sharp with triumph. "McGraw's been digging Boone's grave," Carter declared. "He's hiding gold, I'll stake my life on it. Man's a thief sitting on what belongs to us all." The crowd stirred, suspicion sparking. Ethan's hand tightened on his rifle, but Callahan raised his voice above the noise. "Hold. Boone's grave don't hold gold. It holds Boone and Boone alone. McGraw's told me straight, and I believe him. Murder's the truth here, not treasure." The murmurs grew louder, some shocked, some doubtful. Carter's face darkened, his bluster cracking. "Murder? You expect us to believe that after 20 years? Callahan's gaze locked on him. "I expect you to answer for it. You knew Boone, Carter. You were prospecting these hills when he disappeared, and his rifle's in that grave with him." Yours and Boone's feud was no secret. Carter's bravado faltered, his eyes darting. "You can't pin this on me." But the crowd had shifted. Old men nodded, recalling quarrels, recalling threats whispered in saloons long ago. Martha Ellis stepped forward from the edge of the gathering, her voice calm but steady. "I remember Boone's wife. She feared you, Carter. Said you swore he'd never see another spring. Maybe she was right." The sheriff moved quick, clapping irons on Carter before he could bolt. The prospector cursed, spitting rage, but the crowd no longer listened. Justice, slow and heavy as the mountains, had finally stirred. That evening, Ethan sat outside the cabin, lantern light spilling across the clearing. The grave lay still, the marker standing firm as it had for decades. Yet something felt lighter in the air, as though a chain had been broken. The truth was no longer buried. Boone's story had been spoken, his death no longer hidden in silence. Martha rode up the trail before night fully settled. She dismounted, her face solemn but kind. "Word spreads fast. The town won't soon forget what you did. Some will curse you for stirring it, others will thank you. But Boone's ghost is quieter tonight." Ethan looked out across the valley, the dog at his side. "I didn't do it for thanks, just couldn't live in a house built on lies." Martha studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Then maybe you found more than a house, Mr. McGraw. Maybe you found a home." Her words settled deep. For the first time since Samuel's death, Ethan felt the stirrings of peace. Yet peace, he knew, was a thing tested by time. The wind moved through the pines, softer than before, carrying no warning, only the hush of a land finally unburdened. The mountains were quiet now, their silence no longer sharp with warning but softened, as if exhaling after holding a breath too long. Ethan McGraw stood by the cabin he had bought for 10 cents, the same cabin that had nearly cost him his sanity. The grave remained, its marker weathered but dignified, no longer a threat but a memorial. He had filled it with care, packed the earth tight, and carved new letters into the wood. Silas Boone, may truth keep you company. He ran his hand along the marker one last time, not with suspicion but with respect. Rest easy now, he said quietly. The dog pressed close to his leg, tail swaying, its unease finally gone. The land felt different, lighter, though the same wind still carried pine and snow. Inside the cabin, warmth filled the air. Repairs were finished. The hearth stood strong and the walls no longer whispered drafts. It was more than shelter. It was proof that Ethan could take broken things and make them whole again. Perhaps that was why fate had led him here, to face the shadow of Boone's death and the weight of his own solitude. Martha Ellis visited often now, bringing bread or coffee, her presence steady as stone. They sat together on the porch some evenings, watching the sun sink behind the ridges. She would speak of town, of changes since Carter's arrest, and of how some folks still eyed the cabin with unease. Ethan listened, sometimes answering, sometimes only letting the sound of her voice remind him he was no longer alone. "You've turned this place into something new," she told him one evening, her gaze sweeping the clearing. "Boone's name was a curse. Now it's a memory, one carried honest." Ethan nodded slowly. A man can't outrun ghosts forever. Best way to quiet 'em is to face 'em down. She smiled faintly. "And you have. Maybe more than most men ever would." The words sank deep. For years, Ethan had roamed with no tether, his brother's death chained to his heart. But here, in the shadow of Boone's grave, he had found the strength to stop running. This cabin, bought for a dime, had cost him sweat, blood, and sleepless nights, yet it had given him something worth more than gold: belonging. The valley itself seemed to recognize the shift. Birds returned to the trees, their calls filling the mornings. Deer grazed near the creek without fear. Even the wind felt changed, brushing the cabin walls like a song rather than a warning. Ethan rose with the sun each day, no longer just to survive but to live. Still, he carried a lesson from it all. The land did not give without testing. It pressed on a man, cut him down to the marrow, and only if he stood true did it allow him peace. Boone had failed that test, undone by greed and betrayal. Jed Carter had failed it too, driven by the same hunger. But Ethan had endured. He had faced both the living and the dead, and he remained. One night, as stars blanketed the sky, he sat by the fire and spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear but the dog. "Home," he said, the word no longer foreign. It fit now, like a coat worn in. And so the cabin stood, not just wood and stone, but a testament carved from shadows, a place where truth had been unearthed and silence finally broken. Ethan McGraw, mountain man, had bought it for 10 cents, but the price he paid was measured in courage, in trust, and in the resolve to stand when every voice, living or dead, told him to turn away. If you followed this story, make sure to subscribe for more tales of grit and truth from the Old West. And don't stop here. Click the next story waiting on your screen and keep riding deeper into the frontier.